Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of RORKE'S Drift, 1879. The Anglo-Zulu War. It began with the smell of rain on dry grass and the whisper of war on the wind. Natal Province, Southern Africa. January 1879. The sky was a bleached canvas of dust and cloud, cracked with distant heat. The land stretched wide and quiet. But that silence, it was heavy. It had weight, as if something was holding its breath. At a lonely mission station near the Buffalo River, a place called RORKE'S Drift, a handful of British soldiers and colonial troops went about their duties. Mealie bags were stacked, sentries rotated, weapons cleaned in the sweltering heat. None of them knew, not yet, that by the next morning, this place would become a charnel house. A storm of blood and fire, one of the most extraordinary last stands in British military history. And it was already on its way. To understand RORKE'S Drift, you have to start with Isandlwana. Just hours earlier, but a few dozen miles east, disaster had struck. A British column over 1,700 strong had been overwhelmed by the Zulu army in broad daylight. Crushed, routed. A catastrophe. Red-coated bodies lay across the hills in heaps, slashed, pierced, stripped. Isandlwana wasn't just a military defeat, it was an obliteration. The Zulus, armed with spears, shields, and a few scavenged rifles, had shown the full power of a coordinated impi charge. Wave after wave had poured over the British lines, horns of the buffalo encircling the enemy, and then closing. No quarter, no mercy, no survivors. And now, flushed with victory, thousands of Zulu warriors turned their eyes toward the tiny depot at RORKE'S Drift. They were coming. The outpost itself was barely defensible. A converted missionary station, it had been repurposed by British troops into a field hospital and supply store. A chapel stood at one end in the main building, and a nearby storehouse for supplies. Between them, a dusty courtyard. No walls, no towers, no trenches, just open space and fear. Inside were 139 men, most of them from B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. Many were wounded or ill. Most were exhausted. Command rested in the hands of two junior officers, Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th. Two men, barely tested in combat, about to face one of the most relentless assaults in modern history. John Chard wasn't a man built for legend. Practical, soft-spoken, methodical. An engineer, not a warrior, he'd been sent to RORKE'S Drift simply to repair pontoons on the river crossing. Bromhead was more at home with soldiering, sharp, confident, but partially deaf, and often dismissed by superiors. Neither man was a household name. Neither had medals or glory. But here's the thing about history. Sometimes it doesn't ask. It just happens, and either you rise or you fall. When news of the slaughter at Isandlwana reached RORKE'S Drift, Chard took command. It was a matter of seniority, not choice. But from that moment he never wavered. He and Bromhead gathered the men, told them the truth. Thousands of Zulus were coming, and they were on their own. No reinforcements, no escape. Just the men beside you, and the will to survive. They had, at best, a few hours to prepare. Working in suffocating heat, the defenders turned wagons into barricades, pulled down walls to create firing positions, stacked biscuit boxes and mealie bags, sacks of maize, into makeshift redoubts. The hospital was converted into a final holdout. Doors braced, windows smashed for firing ports. Every weapon was checked, Every round of ammunition counted. They were armed primarily with Martini Henry rifles, single-shot, breech-loading weapons that fired heavy .45 caliber rounds. Powerful, accurate, but single-shot, and each thick round needed to be manually reloaded. Against a tidal wave of enemies with spears, the margin for error was razor-thin. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the landscape around the post had changed. It looked less like a mission station and more like a desperate barricade. Then, just after 4 o'clock, the first Zulu scouts were spotted cresting the ridge. What followed was a moment burned into memory. A low hum, then a rising roar. And suddenly, the hills were alive with warriors. Over 4,000 Zulu fighters advanced toward Rorke's Drift, part of the reserve force from Isandlwana. Unlike the British, they carried no banners, no bugles, just raw momentum. Some carried assegais, short stabbing spears, and ox-hide shields. Others had taken rifles from the dead. Their eyes burned with fury, their feet kicked up dust, their chants shook the air. And then they charged. The defenders opened fire at 50 yards. Martini Henrys barked in unison, a thunderous crack that rolled across the plain. The first wave staggered, hit hard. Men fell, torn open by heavy rounds. But the Zulus didn't break. They surged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. It was chaos, pure, visceral, unrelenting. At the northern wall, bayonets clashed with spears. Men fired point blank. Screams pierced the air, Zulu war cries answered by British shouts and the hiss of smoke. Chard moved from position to position, checking defences, rallying men. Bromhead held the hospital line, barking orders, bleeding from a cut to the head. The hospital itself became a furnace. Inside the makeshift wards, wounded men lay on cots, many unable to walk. As the Zulus surrounded the building, they began setting fire to the thatched roof. Smoke poured in. The heat grew unbearable. Corporal Christian Ferdinand Schaes, a Swiss volunteer, fought hand-to-hand in the hallway, helping to drag men from their beds. Private John Williams smashed holes through the walls with the butt of his rifle, carving a path from room to room, rescuing the wounded as fire rained from above. They moved under gunfire, crawled over dying comrades, hauled men through flames and smoke, and still the enemy came. The Zulus stormed the outer hospital wall. Some burst inside. Fighting became brutal, close, savage. There were no ranks, no formations, just survival. Outside, the sun dipped lower. Shadows lengthened. The smell of blood mingled with smoke and gunpowder. The walls of the redoubt were slick with sweat, ash and iron. The British fired until their rifles glowed, until their fingers blistered, until their shoulders ached with every pull of the lever. The Martini Henry kicked like a mule, its recoil thudding into bone. Its report was deafening, but it dropped men with a single shot. And still, the Zulus kept coming. They climbed over the dead, threw themselves at the barricades, crawled under wagons, tried to burn the defences down. At one point the defenders fell back into the central storehouse courtyard. Their lines breached. The night would only get darker. And yet they held. Somehow, through sheer bloody defiance, they held. A few dozen men against thousands, firing in darkness, fighting back to back. No food, no water, no rest. The wounded took up rifles. The dying reloaded cartridges. A chaplain moved among the men, offering last rites, and then picking up a weapon himself. The chaplain. By midnight, the Zulu attacks began to slow. Not because they were finished, but because they were exhausted. Bodies lay everywhere, friend and foe alike. The fires burned low. The defenders, faces grey with smoke and shock, stood in silence. listening for another attack, waiting for dawn. It never truly got quiet. Not really. But there was a pause, a breath, and they held it. Night at Rorke's Drift was not silence. It was breathless, a low, taut hum, like the moment before a storm breaks. The wounded lay where they'd fallen, some conscious, some not. Soot clung to skin. Blood soaked into the dirt. Rifles rested in blistered hands, barrels blackened from heat. Every eye stared outward toward the shadows, listening. And then a shape moved. Someone hissed. A trigger clicked, a rifle shouted its thunder, and the battle began again. The next wave came just after midnight. No war cry, no build-up, just sudden snarling contact. Zulu warriors swarming from the dark, appearing like ghosts. Spears flashing in the moonlight, rifles cracked from the gloom. The defenders snapped to action like coiled springs. The courtyard lit up with muzzle flashes. Chard barked orders. Bromhead shoved fresh rounds into his rifle with shaking fingers. Men who could barely stand fired from one knee, teeth gritted, sleeves soaked red. It was chaos, but by now it was familiar. This was the rhythm of survival. Fire, reload, fire again. Don't think, don't flinch, don't hesitate. Because if you did, you were dead. They fought like cornered animals. A dozen men on the firing line at any one time. The others passed ammunition, cared for the wounded, or stood ready to replace the fallen. Private Henry Hook, once known for laziness and drinking, had become a fury in the hospital firestorm. Now he stood guard at the barricade, eyes wild, shirt scorched black. Behind him the chaplain, Reverend George Smith, worked like a man possessed, delivering ammunition box by box, running between redoubts, ducking and weaving like a veteran courier. Everyone played their part. There was no room for bystanders. Every shot had to count. Every second mattered. By 2 a.m. the night had twisted into something unnatural. The smoke from the hospital fires hung low, a choking blanket that blurred sight and muffled sound. Embers drifted like fireflies. Men stumbled, shouted, vanished in the fog. At one point a group of Zulus breached the outer barricade. For a heartbeat it looked like the end. But the defenders rallied. Bayonets thrust forward. Rifle butts cracked skulls. One man used a shovel as a weapon, swinging wildly, screaming curses into the dark. The Zulus were relentless, but even they could feel it now. The resistance wasn't breaking, it was hardening, like steel tempered in flame. There was a moment around 3 a.m. when the fire slackened, just slightly, and in that eerie pause the defenders could hear it, the sound of Zulu voices, not shouting now but chanting, a slow rhythmic pulse, a war hymn, a song of fury and mourning. They were regrouping, preparing for one final push. Lieutenant Chard, filthy and exhausted, moved from position to position, his voice hoarse but steady. "We hold until dawn," he muttered to anyone who'd listen. "If they break us before then, we're done. If we hold, we live." He looked like a ghost. Soot-blackened face, torn uniform, one sleeve burned at the cuff. But his eyes were clear, focused. Beside him Bromhead leaned against a barricade, cradling a rifle across his knees. He hadn't spoken in over an hour, just nodded when spoken to. Kept his eyes on the dark. They weren't men anymore, they were machines. Battered, bloodied machines made of bone and rage. The final attack came just before dawn. Not a charge, a surge. As if the earth itself had split open and vomited fury. Hundreds of Zulu warriors stormed the barricades from all sides, spears raised, voices rising in crescendo. They moved fast, using the early grey light as cover, throwing themselves at the mealy bag walls with terrifying momentum. They climbed the defences, leapt over fallen comrades, jammed their shields into the gaps. Inside, the defenders fired point blank, so close the muzzle flashes lit the faces of their enemies, painted with ash, sweat and resolve. One defender was dragged from the wall, stabbed through the chest, thrown aside. Another filled the gap before his body hit the ground. Martini. Henry rifles barked one after another, a brutal rhythm. Click, crack, smoke, click, crack, smoke. The defenders were down to their last few boxes of ammunition. Some men fired, then passed their rifles back to be reloaded by comrades behind them. Even the wounded helped, ripping cartridges with their teeth, passing bullets forward. A bullet struck the Union Jack flying above the barricade, tearing through the cloth. It flapped in the wind like a wounded bird. But it didn't fall, and neither did the men beneath it. At last, a shift. The pressure eased, slightly, just enough to be felt. Then, the cries began to fade. The Zulu ranks slowed, then stopped, then fell back. It wasn't a rout, it wasn't defeat. It was recognition. The battle was over. The sun rose slowly over the battlefield. Orange light spilled across the smoke-stained earth, revealing the aftermath in brutal clarity. Over 350 Zulu dead lay scattered around the post, some in heaps, others alone where they'd fallen. More had been wounded or carried away by comrades in the night. Inside the barricades, 17 British soldiers were dead, many more wounded. Nearly every man had blood on his clothes, whether his own or someone else's. The walls were scorched, the hospital a ruin. The courtyard reeked of blood, gunpowder and fire. But they had held, they had survived. For hours, nothing moved. Then, a scout shouted. On the horizon, a column of men appeared. British reinforcements. At last. They had missed the battle, but they brought with them news, supplies, and the first outsiders to see what had happened here. Even hardened soldiers stared in disbelief. What had looked like a humble mission post was now a fortress of ruin and glory, a place where the impossible had been done. By mid-morning, the men of RORKE'S drift sat in silence, cleaning their rifles. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the sky. The chaplain walked among them, offering water or prayers. Nobody refused either, and in the centre of the yard the Union Jack still fluttered in the breeze, scorched, pierced, tattered, but flying. The sun was high by the time the scale of it all began to settle in. They were alive, but they didn't feel victorious. Victory should feel like triumph, like celebration. This felt like exhaustion, like silence where there should be sound, like the weight of 1,000 dead pressing into the soul. Some of the men stood quietly near the makeshift redoubt, kicking through broken cartridges and scorched splinters. Others sat, backs against the walls they had defended, staring at the blood-soaked earth. 17 of their own lay still. Dozens more wounded. And all around them, Zulu bodies, stripped and left by comrades who had retreated with silent discipline at first light. It wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a graveyard. When the relief column arrived later that morning, led by Lord Chelmsford himself, there was no applause, no cheers, just wary eyes, and an overwhelming sense of too late. Chard and Bromhead greeted him formally. Salutes were exchanged, but the air was thick with tension. Chelmsford had been absent, out on a fruitless march, while Isandlwana burned and RORKE'S drift bled. He walked the perimeter in silence, taking in the wreckage, the blackened hospital, the spent rounds, the torn flag. He offered no grand speeches, just a few quiet words to Chard. "Well done, Lieutenant." And that was it. For the men who had held the line, it would never quite be over. They were sent back to British territory within days, some to hospitals, others to garrison duty. Medals were promised, reports were written, but the ghosts followed. At night they heard the ululation of war cries in their dreams, smelled the smoke again, felt the heat of the fire in their lungs. For those who had fought, really fought, survival didn't feel like deliverance. It felt like debt. Back in Britain, however, the story ignited like wildfire. The papers, hungry to explain the humiliating loss at Isandlwana, seized on Rorke's drift like a gift from the gods. A miracle stand, a heroic defence, a thin red line of empire against the barbaric hordes. Illustrations were published, speeches made in Parliament. The Queen herself demanded commendations. The contrast was perfect. One battle a disaster, the other a defiant victory. The public clung to Rorke's drift as proof that British courage had not failed, that the Empire still had backbone. But in the rush to mythologise, a darker truth was lost. The Zulu warriors at Rorke's drift were not savages. They were disciplined, strategic, brave beyond reason. Many of them had fought at Isandlwana, a fight they had won, and yet they had been ordered to continue, to attack a fortified position for little strategic gain. They obeyed. They fought with honour, using every tactic they could: fire, flanking, sheer mass. They died in hundreds, and yet their legacy was largely written by the pens of their enemies. Their stories, their names, were mostly lost. But they mattered. They always mattered. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, the most ever for a single engagement. Chard and Bromhead both received theirs, so did Hook, so did Sheese, so did a dozen men who had stood, side by side, in the mouth of hell. It was honour, recognition, but also politics. Critics later argued the awards were excessive, an attempt to paper over the disaster at Isandlwana, that the glory of Rorke's Drift had been inflated to comfort a shaken public. Maybe so. But medals or not, those men had done the impossible. They had held the line, against all odds, against 4,000. With no cavalry, no artillery, no promises, only courage, only grit, only each other. Rorke's Drift became legend. It was immortalised in paintings, in plays, in films, most famously in the 1964 classic Zulu, where Michael Caine and Stanley Baker played Bromhead and Chard as icons of British resolve. But behind the iconography, behind the polished uniforms and dramatic trumpets, was something raw. A group of men who hadn't asked for glory, who hadn't expected to live, who made peace with death and kept standing anyway. They weren't perfect, they weren't larger than life. They were just enough. And in war, sometimes, that's everything. In the years that followed, the Anglo-Zulu War ground on. More battles, more blood. Eventually, the British overwhelmed the Zulu kingdom through firepower, numbers, and colonial machinery. By 1887, Zululand was fully annexed. The empire had won. But something of value had been lost in the process. Something deeper than territory. A culture, a history. A defiance that couldn't be crushed, only drowned. Rorke's Drift sits now as a monument, not just to one battle, but to the strange, fragile line between survival and memory, between what happened and what we remember. Chard died of cancer in 1897, Bromhead of typhoid in India. Both men were buried with honours and silence. Hook lived until 1905. He rarely spoke of the battle, except to say that it had never left him. The others, The ones who weren't awarded medals, who weren't mentioned in dispatches, faded quietly into the pages of history. But they all carried it. Every last one. The weight of what happened and what didn't. Rorke's drift was never supposed to matter. It was a depot, a waypoint, a speck on a campaign map. But in the crucible of war, it became something more. Not a symbol of empire, not a stage for glory. A reminder that courage is never tidy, that survival has a cost, and that history, the real kind, is so often made by men who never asked for it. Just men, holding a line, together. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.